12 shells, 11 fires. That was how the dragons counted the hatching later, when they told the story among themselves in the high volcanic ridges of Solva Prime. 12 eggs had rested in the ash nest for 4 months. 12 heartbeats, slow and deep, had pulsed through the stone during the long nights. And when the triple moons aligned on the last day of the cold season, 11 of them answered with fire. The first hatchling came out roaring, scales already bright copper, a small jet of orange flame shooting from its mouth before it had even fully freed itself from the shell. The crowd of elder dragons watching from the ridge made a low sound of approval. The second hatchling followed, then the third, the fourth. Each one loud, each one burning, each one exactly what a dragon was supposed to be. The 12th shell did not move. Elder Garath watched it from his place at the head of the ridge. He was old enough that the ridges on his skull had grown ridges of their own. He had watched hundreds of hatchings. He knew what a dead shell looked like. He knew what a late shell looked like. This one was neither. It was simply still, while the ash around it glowed with the warmth of its 11 siblings. Then, after a silence that went on long enough to become embarrassing, the shell split. Not with a crack, not with fire. It opened slowly, like something too tired to make a show of it, and a small shape rolled out into the ash and lay there. No flame, no sound, no heat. The hatchling was half the size of the smallest of her siblings. Her scales were gray, not the silver gray of the mountain breed, which carried light like polished stone, but a dull, flat gray, the color of old rain on concrete. Her wings were folded against her back and did not spread. She lifted her head, blinked twice at the crowd of elder dragons looming above her, and then simply sat in the cooling ash and looked at them. The silence from the ridge was a different kind now. Garath stepped down from the ridge and walked to the nest. He circled the small hatchling once, slowly, his great head lowering to examine her. He breathed a small controlled pulse of heat at her, a standard test. A healthy hatchling should flinch or answer in kind, or at least show a reaction in the scales. She did nothing. Her scales did not warm. Her eyes tracked him calmly. He straightened and turned to the mother, who had not moved from her place at the edge of the nest. "Hollow," he said. It was not a question. It was not a diagnosis. It was a verdict. No fire. No heat response. No energy signature. The old law is clear. The mother looked at her smallest hatchling for a long moment. The hatchling looked back at her. Then the mother turned and followed her 11 healthy young up the ridge, and did not look back. The elder dragons dispersed before the moons had finished setting. The hatchling stayed where she was, alone in the ash, and made no sound about any of it. Darren arrived at the Highland the next morning on a routine survey. He was a xenobiologist, which was a title that meant he spent most of his time in places other people considered either boring or inhospitable. The volcanic highlands qualified as both. He had a scanner, a field pack, a thermos of something that had stopped being hot 2 hours ago, and no particular expectation of finding anything interesting. He found her anyway. She was half buried in ash where the night wind had pushed it against the far edge of the nest site. He almost walked past her. His scanner caught a faint biological reading. Not heat, which was strange, but mass, a small living mass, ambient temperature, impossible for a dragon, and he stopped and dug her out with his hands. She fit in both his palms. She looked up at him with the same calm expression she had given Garath, apparently unbothered by the change in situation. His scanner read her temperature as exactly matching the surrounding air. He shook the scanner, checked the calibration, and scanned her again. Same result. He sat down in the ash, set her carefully on his knee, and spent several minutes trying to understand what his instruments were telling him. They were telling him that she was alive. They were telling him that she was producing no energy output of any kind. They were telling him that she had been lying in sub-freezing ash all night and showed no signs of hypothermia, because her body temperature had simply matched the ash and stayed there. He picked her up and put her in his field pack, leaving the top open so she could breathe. She did not protest. She seemed, if anything, mildly curious about the interior of the pack. He carried her back to the outpost. Every regulation in the Frontier Xenobiology Handbook said he should not have done that. He had read the handbook. He chose to remember it selectively. That evening, sitting at his workbench with the hatchling on the table between his scanner and his notes, he looked up the draconic word for the kind of fire that burns inside stone, invisible until the mountain finally opens. The closest word in his grandmother's old language was a simple one. Rail. He wrote it on a scrap label, stuck it to the edge of the table, and looked at her. She was watching his scanner with focused attention, as if she was trying to figure out what it did. He had no idea yet how much she was already learning. Word among dragons travels faster than it has any right to, given that most of them prefer silence. Within 2 weeks of Darren bringing Rail back to the outpost, Garath knew about it. Within a month, the whole conclave knew. The reaction moved through 3 phases. First, amusement, which took the form of low rumbling sounds during formal meetings whenever someone mentioned the human and his hollow hatchling. Then mild annoyance, because the situation was undignified and someone should do something about it. Then, once it became clear that Darren had filed xenobiological protection papers with the Frontier Authority and was not going to be easily moved, a cold and formal anger. None of this reached Darren directly. He was busy. 6 months into his arrangement with Rail, he had filled 4 research logs with observations he did not fully understand yet. She ate well, raw protein packs meant for large frontier fauna, twice the recommended amount for her size, which should have produced measurable energy output in her growing body. It produced nothing detectable. She slept deeply and woke alert. She followed him around the outpost with the focused attention of something that was learning everything it saw and filing it away carefully. She still produced no heat, no fire, no energy signature of any kind his instruments could name. He had started deliberate experiments in the 3rd month, small and careful. A standard heat lamp positioned above her resting spot. A sonic emitter set to low frequency. A mild radiation source from a decommissioned survey tool, well within safe ranges. Each test lasted 1 hour. Each test was followed by an hour of scanning. The results were the same every time. The energy went in. Nothing came back out. His instruments confirmed she absorbed it. They could not confirm where it went. He labeled a new log entry. Retention, no measurable loss over 72-hour monitoring period. Unknown storage mechanism. He stared at that entry for a while. Then he made coffee and stared at it some more. Garath came on a quiet afternoon in the 6th month, and he did not come alone. There were 4 other conclave elders with him. They arranged themselves outside the outpost in a formation that was technically a visit and functionally a wall. Darren walked out to meet them with his scanner still in one hand and ash on his boots. Rail came with him. She had taken to staying close to his left side, which he had started thinking of as her preferred position. She sat down next to his left boot and regarded the 5 elder dragons with no visible change in expression. The contrast was notable. Garath's smallest scale was larger than her entire body. Garath said what he had come to say with the formal precision of someone who had rehearsed it. The hatchling was a medical and cultural liability. The conclave had a responsibility for the integrity of the draconic bloodline on Solva Prime. There were old protocols. The right thing, for the creature as well, was a peaceful end administered by the conclave healers. No suffering. Clean. He said it the way someone says something they have decided is reasonable and therefore does not require the other person's agreement. Darren listened to all of it without interrupting. When Garath finished, Darren cited 4 frontier xenobiological protection statutes from memory, in order, with their registration numbers. He explained that Rail had been registered as a protected study subject under his research license, which the Frontier Authority had approved, which meant any interference with her person constituted a violation of frontier law. He said all of this pleasantly, the way someone says something they have also prepared in advance. Garath looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Rail. She looked back at him. She yawned, showing small teeth that had no fire behind them. One of the other elders made a sound that was almost a laugh. Garath silenced it with a look. He told Darren the conclave would not forget this. He meant it as a warning. He turned, and the 5 of them left. That evening, Scylla came over to review Darren's logs. She was a xenolinguist who worked 2 buildings over and had been skeptical of the whole situation from the start, mostly because she was skeptical of everything as a general policy. She sat at his table, read through 4 months of experiment records, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "She is not failing to produce energy." Darren looked up. "She is consuming it," Scylla said. "Everything you put in. She takes it, and it goes somewhere inside her, and it does not come back." She looked up from the logs. "That is not a broken energy system." That is a very different energy system. Darren had been thinking the same thing for 2 months. It was different hearing it said out loud. They were still discussing it an hour later when the room got cold. Not gradually cold, the way rooms get cold when heat leaks out. Instantly cold, as if the air had been replaced. 4 degrees in under 2 seconds, according to the ambient sensor on the table. Then the temperature returned to normal. Exactly normal, as if it had never moved. Rael was sitting between them, watching the sensor. When the reading stabilized, she looked up at Darren. Scylla stared at her. She did that deliberately. Darren watched Rael watching the sensor that she had been studying for 6 months. Yes, he said quietly. I think she was showing us she could. He opened a new log file. At the top he wrote, "She understands the instruments." He paused, then added, "She has been watching me measure her. She knows what I am looking for." He looked at her. She was still watching the sensor, calm and patient, waiting to see what they would do next. He had the sudden strong feeling that he was not the only one running experiments in this outpost. The blizzard came without much warning, which was normal for Solva Prime's deep winter. The Frontier weather system gave a 6-hour notice. Darren used 4 of those hours to secure the exterior equipment, reinforce the outpost seals, and stock the interior with enough food and water for a week. He used the remaining 2 hours to lose power. Not a partial outage. Total. The geothermal relay buried under the Highland Road took a direct hit from a falling ice shelf, and every building in the research settlement went dark inside of 30 seconds. The backup generator for the outpost caught the surge and tripped its own breaker. By the time Darren found the breaker box in the dark with a hand light, the interior temperature had already dropped 8 degrees. He reset the breaker. The generator started, ran for 4 minutes, and stopped again. The surge had damaged something he could not fix in the dark during a blizzard. The temperature kept falling. Scylla was stuck in her own building across the settlement. The comm units worked on emergency battery, so she told him to stay put and insulate as much as he could. He piled every piece of fabric he owned onto the single cot in the back room, got under it, and assessed his situation with the calm honesty that frontier postings teach very quickly. The outpost walls were good, but not built for a heating failure in deep winter. At the current rate of heat loss, the interior would reach dangerous temperatures in 3 to 4 hours. Scylla would call for a settlement rescue vehicle, but those vehicles moved slowly in blizzard conditions. The math was not comfortable. Rael had followed him into the back room. She was now the size of a large dog, after a year of steady, if slow growth. She climbed onto the cot beside him without asking, turned twice like a creature settling in for a nap, and lay down along his side. She was, as always, exactly ambient temperature. No warmth, just weight and presence. Darren lay in the dark and listened to the wind hit the walls and did not sleep. An hour passed. The temperature dropped further. He could see his own breath. Then Rael lifted her head. She had been still so long he had started to think she was asleep. But she was awake, and she was looking at him with that focused, considering expression he had come to recognize, the one that meant she was deciding something. She opened her mouth. What came out was not fire. There was no flame, no light, no burning. What came out was heat, pure, clean, radiant heat, steady and even, like standing near a furnace rather than near a flame. It poured out in a slow column and spread through the back room in a way that fire never would have. Controlled, even, precise. Darren sat up. The ambient sensor on the shelf, battery-powered, still running, started climbing. 5 degrees. 10. It hit the standard interior comfort range in under 3 minutes and held there, as if Rael was reading the sensor and adjusting to match it. She was looking at the sensor. She probably was reading it. Darren stared at her. She closed her mouth, tilted her head at him, and waited. He grabbed his data pad from under the blankets, pulled up the experiment logs with shaking hands, shaking from cold, not fear, he told himself, and started running numbers. He added up the total energy input from every test he had run over the past year. Heat lamp hours, sonic emitter sessions, the radiation source tests. He converted everything to kilojoules using the standard conversion tables and got a number. Then he asked the ambient sensor for its estimate of the thermal energy currently in the room. The numbers matched. Not roughly, not approximately. They matched to within 1%, which was the margin of sensor error. She had held every kilojoule for a full year without losing a single one. and she had released it at a temperature and rate that a human body could safely handle. In a room she knew the dimensions of, targeting a sensor she had watched him use hundreds of times. He sat very still for a moment. Then he wrote in his log, "Perfect retention, perfect recall, perfect control, not a broken dragon. An entirely different kind of dragon." The blizzard ended the following morning. The rescue vehicle arrived 4 hours after that, which would have been too late if Rail had not kept the outpost at a livable temperature all night, never once letting it drift more than a degree from comfortable. Garath appeared at the outpost 2 days later. Word had reached the Highland, through the Frontier Settlement Gossip Network, that something unusual had happened during the blizzard. Garath had come to see for himself. He had also come, Darren suspected, to renew his case for taking Rail. He found Rail sitting in the yard outside the outpost, in the thin winter sun. Her scales caught the light differently than they had 6 months ago. There was a depth to them now, a faint shifting quality, as if something moved underneath. Darren had noted it in his logs. He thought it might be the stored energy pressing against the inside of her scales the way heat presses against the inside of a closed hand. Garath made his usual speech. Darren gave his usual legal answer. The conversation went the same way it always went, until Garath turned to leave. Then Rail made a small sound, not a growl, not a hiss, just a shift in her breathing, and released a single precise pulse of low-frequency sonic energy. The exact frequency Darren had tested 8 months ago. It hit the ground 18 inches in front of Garath's leading foot and sent a visible ripple through the packed snow. Garath stopped. He looked down at the snow. He looked at Rail. She looked back at him the way she always looked at everything, calm, quiet, and aware of far more than anyone gave her credit for. Garath did not say anything. He left, but this time he looked back once before the treeline swallowed him, and the expression on his face was not contempt. Scylla, watching from the doorway, wrote one line in her own log that evening. She remembers everything she has ever been given. She chooses what to give back, and when, and to whom. Darren read it over her shoulder and said nothing. He was thinking about what a creature like that might do if someone gave her something truly large to hold. He did not yet know the Vorcai were coming. The settlement's long-range detection array picked them up on a clear afternoon, 18 months after Darren had found a small gray hatchling in the ash and made a decision that broke every rule in the handbook. 17 ships. Vorcai configuration. They dropped out of transit in a loose formation above the ecliptic and held position there, broadcasting on every open channel in a language that the Frontier translation systems rendered as, "We have arrived. Acknowledge and prepare for inventory assessment." Inventory. That was the word they used. The settlement's emergency frequency lit up immediately. Darren was in the middle of a calibration test with Rail when the alert came through on his comm. He read it twice, set the comm down on the workbench, and looked at her. She was now the size of a small horse. Her growth had stayed slow and steady, never the dramatic surges the other hatchlings in her clutch had gone through, but it had been consistent. Her wings had developed length, though they still did not open the way a healthy dragon's wings should. They folded against her sides in a way that looked incomplete. Her scales had continued to deepen in that shifting, layered quality. In direct light, they moved through colors slowly, like oil on still water, every shade representing something stored inside. She was looking at the comm unit. She had heard the alert. "You know what they want," he said. It was not really a question. She looked at him. The Vorcai had been a problem on the frontier for 2 decades. They were technologically sophisticated in most areas and extraordinarily sophisticated in one, energy weaponry. Their ships ran on cores harvested from living dragons, removed surgically, the dragon surviving the procedure just long enough to be considered a non-lethal extraction by their legal standards. A dragon core, once harvested, powered a Vorcai warship for 11 years. They had standing fleets. They had standing demand. The Frontier Authority had been filing protests with the Inter-System Council for 15 years. The Council had been acknowledging those protests for 15 years. The Vorcai had been ignoring both the protests and the Council for 15 years, because they had 17 warships and the Frontier Authority had 4 defensive vessels, one of which was currently in dry dock. Admiral Bryn's relief fleet was 3 days out. The settlement had been informed. 3 days was a long time. The record described a creature called the Hollow Dragon. In the old Vorcai harvester tradition, passed through generations of extraction crews. The hollow dragon was a warning. It looked like a failed dragon. No fire, no heat, no energy signature. It was always small. It was always quiet. The warning said, if your instruments read nothing, leave. Leave immediately. Do not engage. Do not attempt extraction. The hollow dragon will take everything you bring and give it back in ways you are not prepared for. The record noted that most harvester crews who had encountered the legend dismissed it as a myth invented to scare new recruits. The record further noted that the crews who dismissed it tended not to file follow-up reports. The file reached Darren's outpost at the same time it reached everyone else. He read it at his desk. He read it again. He looked at the calculation he had run 3 months ago, sitting open in a secondary window. The total stored energy in Rail's body, estimated from 18 months of documented absorption tests, converted into the standard frontier unit for weapons-grade output. The number was very large. He sat quietly with that for a moment. Garath called the conclave to the highland the same afternoon. 11 adult dragons, the full complement on Solva Prime. They were formidable. A dragon in full health was not a trivial opponent even for armored Vorcai boarding craft. But 11 dragons against 17 warships with energy disruption weapons designed specifically for dragon physiology was not a fight. It was a harvest with extra steps. The Vorcai energy disruption weapon worked by flooding an area with a specific frequency that overwhelmed a dragon's internal energy system and shut it down. Stunned, not dead. Easier to transport. The conclave knew this. They had no answer for it. Darren walked up to the highland that evening. Rail came with him, moving beside his left leg the way she always did. The elder dragons watched her approach the way they always did, with the particular attention that discomfort produces when it does not want to show itself as discomfort. Garath met them at the edge of the ridge. He was brisk about it. The situation, the numbers, the absence of good options. Darren said he had read the Vorcai archive file. Garath said he had read it also. He said it with the tone of someone who had not entirely decided what to do with what they had read. Darren looked at Rail. She was watching the sky where the Vorcai ships were holding position, visible at this altitude as small hard points of reflected light among the stars. She has been absorbing energy inputs for 18 months, Darren said. Documented. Logged. I have the numbers. The total stored is significant. He paused. Their disruption weapon is an energy input. Garath was quiet for a long moment. You want to let them fire at her. I want to let them fire first, Darren said. There is a difference. Scylla, who had followed them up, said quietly, Darren. I know, he said. Do you? He looked at Rail. She had stopped watching the sky and was now watching him. Her scales moved slowly through their colors in the last light of the evening, patient and deep and full. She had never once done anything he asked without also making sure she understood it first. She had watched his instruments. She had learned his methods. She had spent 18 months studying the same data he had, from the inside. He crouched down to her level, which was a habit he had kept even as she grew, and which he would keep regardless of how large she eventually became. Your call, he said to her. Always your call. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the lights in the sky. She made a sound low in her chest. Not fire, not threat, something older than either. And she turned and walked back down the highland path toward the outpost, expecting him to follow. He followed. Behind them, Garath stood on the ridge and watched the small gray dragon walk in the dark, her scales carrying the slow light of everything she had ever been given, and said nothing at all. The Vorcai did not wait for dawn. They landed their harvest teams in the last hour of night, which was their standard approach: disoriented targets, poor visibility, faster extraction. 5 armored transport ships came down in the highland clearing, and the lead weapon platform was deployed before the ramps had fully touched the ground. It was a large machine, the disruption platform. It sat on 6 articulated legs and carried a dish array wider than 2 men standing arms out. The Vorcai had used it on 4 other frontier dragon populations in the past decade. It had never failed. The operator brought it to full power and fired a wide area disruption pulse across the highland. The pulse swept out in a visible wave, a shimmer in the air, the kind of distortion that appears above hot metal, moving fast and low across the ground. It covered the highland clearing, the ridge above it, and the trilene below it in under 4 seconds. 11 adult dragons dropped. Garath went to one knee, his scales going dark and flat, his fire suppressed, his limbs suddenly uncertain beneath him. The others fell harder. 3 were fully down, sides heaving, unable to rise. The remaining 7 struggled to stay upright and failed at it slowly. The Vorcai harvest teams moved out of the transports in their insulated suits with their extraction equipment and began walking up the slope with the calm efficiency of a crew that had done this before and expected it to take about an hour. From the trilene below the clearing, Rael walked out. She had no armor. She had nothing. She was still smaller than the youngest adult dragon on that ridge, and in the thin pre-dawn light, she looked exactly as she always had, gray, quiet, unhurried. She walked at a pace that could not fairly be called a charge. It was more like the pace of something that knows where it is going and has decided that rushing would be imprecise. She walked directly into the residual field of the disruption pulse. The Vorcai operator saw her on the sensor array and did not initially understand what he was seeing. His instruments read the same thing Darren's instruments had been reading for 18 months. Ambient temperature, no energy signature, biological mass. The system's threat assessment program cycled through its classifications and returned. Non-threatening, subadult dragon, low priority. He fired the disruption pulse again, directly at her, full strength. Point-blank range for the weapon scale. The shimmer hit her and wrapped around her, and she absorbed it the way dry ground absorbs rain, completely, immediately, without residue. The field collapsed. Not dissipated, collapsed, folding inward around her in a sphere of sudden stillness. Her scales blazed. Not fire, not heat in any open sense. Something underneath the scales, behind them, pressing out through the gray surface in a light that moved through colors the way her scales always had, but now at a speed and brightness that turned the pre-dawn highland into midday. Every frequency she had stored over 18 months of careful experiments. Every test Darren had run. Every hour under the heat lamp. Every sonic burst. Every pulse of safe radiation. The blizzard's worth of retained heat. 2 direct hits from the most powerful disruption weapon the Vorcai fielded. All of it, together, inside something that weighed less than a frontier survey vehicle. The Vorcai commander, watching from the lead transport's upper deck, recognized the description from the archive file. He had read the file. He had dismissed it. He was no longer dismissing it. He ordered a retreat. The order was correct. It was also 40 seconds too late. Rael released with the precision that 18 months of watching Darren's instruments had built into her. She did not explode. She did not rage. She worked the way she had always worked, methodically, specifically, with the careful accuracy of a creature that had spent a year and a half studying cause and effect from the inside. The disruption pulse frequencies went back to the disruption platform, not scattered, directed, along the exact return path the weapon had used to reach her, at the precise frequency the weapon operated on. The platform's own energy system received its output back in the same form it had produced it, and the platform understood this the way any machine understands its own signal in its own receiver. It shut down catastrophically. The thermal energy she released next targeted the transport ship's power conduits. Not the hulls, not the crews, the conduits. She had watched Darren's scanner trace power flows in the outpost's heating system for months. She understood conduits. The energy she directed into each ship's drive conduit was exactly enough to trip the safety overloads. Exactly enough. Not more. The ships went dark. All 5 transports. Simultaneously. Then she turned her attention to the 17 warships still holding position above. She could not reach them directly. She did not need to. What she did was open her scales fully and let the stored light. A full year's worth of absorbed starlight from the Triple Moon Highland. Every test Darren had run with the UV lamp. The blizzard's white sky radiation. Release upward in a single coherent beam narrow enough and intense enough to be read by the warship's proximity sensors as a weapon's discharge. Every warship above raised its defensive shields to maximum. Standard protocol. What they did not realize, until their engineers reported it approximately 90 seconds later, was that their shields operated on an energy absorption cycle that required constant draw from the ship's main power core, and Rael's beam was not stopping. She was feeding it continuously, holding the shields at maximum draw, and the ship's power cores were depleting at a rate their designers had never stress-tested because no external source had ever sustained that kind of pressure. One by one, the warships lost main power and dropped to emergency reserve. Emergency reserve was enough to maintain life support. It was not enough to maintain weapons, engines, or communications above short range. 17 ships. Adrift. In 40 minutes. Admiral Bryn's relief fleet arrived at dawn, 3 days ahead of schedule. They had pushed hard when the distress signal came through. They found 17 Vorcai ships broadcasting emergency signals and 5 landed transports with no power and very confused harvest crews sitting on the highland grass waiting for someone to make a decision. Bryn's first transmission to the settlement was 4 words. What did you do? Darren's response was 3. We didn't. She did. On the highland, Garath stood slowly upright as his energy systems came back online. His scales brightened. He looked across the clearing at Rael, who had walked back to Darren's side, and was now allowing him to check her over with the scanner in the worried, methodical way he always handled her after any kind of exertion. She was fine. The scanner showed nothing unusual. She was, as always, ambient temperature. Her energy signature was undetectable. She had given back everything. She was carrying nothing now except whatever she had absorbed from the sunrise in the past hour, and the warmth of Darren's hands, and whatever conclusions she had drawn from the last 40 minutes that she would not share until she decided the time was right. Garath walked across the clearing. He stopped 3 feet from her. He lowered his great head, slowly, deliberately, until it was level with the ground before her. The full formal gesture of draconic recognition, the one that had not been performed before a living dragon in 4 centuries. Rael watched him. Then she stepped forward and pressed her forehead gently against his. She let a small amount of warmth pass through the contact, just enough to be felt, just enough to be understood. He did not flinch this time. He accepted it. Darren lowered his scanner and said nothing. Some things did not need to be measured. 3 months after the Highland, the Vorcai Empire did something it had not done in 60 years. It recalled its frontier fleets. The official reason filed in their Inter-System Council record was unclassified biological hazard, threat assessment ongoing. There was no mention of a small gray dragon or a human xenobiologist or 18 months of careful laboratory work in a frontier outpost. The Vorcai were, among their other qualities, too proud to explain themselves in detail when a vague entry would do. But every frontier settlement from Solva Prime to the outer markers understood what had happened. The story moved fast, the way stories about impossible things always move, ahead of the facts, gathering weight as it went, so that by the time the official research publication cleared the Frontier Authority's review board, the broader outline was already known by everyone who needed to know it. Darren's paper ran to 47 pages. He had worked on it for 2.5 months, with Scylla editing the linguistic sections and 3 Frontier Authority scientists reviewing the energy data independently to confirm he had not made any arithmetic errors. He had not. The numbers were what they were. The title was precise and entirely plain. Indefinite energy retention and controlled recall in a previously unclassified draconic variant, a longitudinal field study. It had no dramatic language in it. Darren considered dramatic language the enemy of good science. The scientific community's response to it was, in its way, dramatic anyway. The Draconic Conclave met 3 weeks after Bryn's fleet had processed the Vorcai prisoners and forwarded the diplomatic situation to the Inter-System Council. Garath chaired the meeting. Darren was not invited, which was expected and appropriate. Rael was not invited either, which was expected and also not relevant, because she was not the kind of creature who went where she was not wanted. What came out of the meeting, transmitted to the Frontier Authority in formal Draconic and translated within the hour, was a revision to the Conclave's hatchling assessment protocols. The abandonment clause was removed. The hollow designation was reclassified as an alternative developmental variant requiring extended study rather than an indicator of defect. The revision applied retroactively to all recorded cases in Draconic history, which was a considerable and somewhat uncomfortable amount of retroactive revision. Garath signed it first. The others followed. Scylla finished her linguistic analysis of the Vorcai archive that same week. She had been working through their historical records of the Hollow Dragon legend, tracing it across 6 separate cultural periods spanning nearly 800 years of Vorcai expansion. The legend appeared every time they had moved into a new dragon territory. Always the same description. Always the same warning. Always, in the records that followed, the same absence of further harvesting from that particular region. The Vorcai had encountered Rael's kind before, possibly more than once. They had never told anyone, and they had always quietly moved on. Scylla showed Darren her summary. He read it at the kitchen table while Rael dozed in the afternoon sun coming through the wide window. He started laughing about 2/3 of the way through and did not entirely stop for several minutes. Scylla waited him out. The oldest empire on the frontier has been running from this for 8 centuries, she said. And everyone, dragons, humans, the council, had the legend in our own records and called it a myth. Because she looks weak, Darren said. Because she looks like what failure is supposed to look like. Scylla looked at Rael in the window. So everyone decided that was what she was. Rael's wings opened for the first time on a clear morning in the 4th month after the Highland. Not dramatically. She was standing in the yard, watching a high-altitude weather survey drone pass overhead with the same interested attention she gave most mechanical things, and she spread her wings the way someone stretches after sitting still too long, slowly, thoroughly, like it had always been possible, and she had simply been waiting until the moment felt right. They were not the wings of a Highland dragon built for thermal soaring. They were broad and flat, membrane-thin, and in the early light, every stored frequency in her body showed through them like light through colored glass. Layered, deep, shifting. They were, in any honest assessment, not entirely suited for flight. She used them to fold around Darren on cold mornings instead, which he accepted with the composure of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything she decided to do. The Vorcai diplomatic vessel arrived on the last day of the month. It was a small ship, a deliberate signal of peaceable intent, and the diplomat who stepped off it was a senior official named Orcs, who had a careful manner and excellent frontier standard language skills and had clearly been well briefed. He was met at the landing pad by the Frontier Authority liaison, who walked him through the settlement's key figures and points of interest. Orcs asked intelligent questions and took careful notes and behaved exactly as a competent diplomat should. At the research outpost yard, he stopped. Rael was sitting in the sun. She was watching him with the calm, patient attention she gave anyone new, comprehensive, unhurried, and deeply unreadable. Her scales moved slowly through their colors. Her wings were folded. Orcs asked the liaison what the creature was. The liaison told him her name. He asked what she could do. The liaison smiled in the way of someone who has had a very good 3 months and is enjoying the memory of it. "We are not entirely sure yet," she said. "Neither is she." Orcs looked at Rael for a long moment. Rael looked back at him, still and quiet, holding inside her body the starlight of 100 mornings and the energy of weapons designed to subjugate her kind and the warmth of every hand that had ever been laid gently on her scales. She yawned. Orcs made a note in his diplomatic record. At the top of the page for Solva Prime he wrote, "Approach with full courtesy. Make no assumptions about strength." He decided that this was an excellent planet for a long, careful, thoroughly non-hostile dialogue. That evening, Darren sat on the outpost steps in the fading light with a new research log open on his datapad. He had not written anything yet. Rael was beside him, watching the first stars appear, her scales shifting through their deep, slow colors in a way that had stopped surprising him and started feeling like something he would miss terribly on any day it was absent. He had a list of planned experiments for the coming months. Controlled tests on the upper range of her retention capacity. Studies on the wing membrane's energy transparency. A long-term project on whether she could absorb gravitational force and what she might do with it. He looked at the list. He looked at her. She was watching something in the sky that he could not see, with the expression that meant she was already 3 thoughts ahead of the conversation. He closed the datapad. Some questions were better lived than answered. He had learned that from her, along with everything else, that patience was not the same as passivity, that silence was not the same as emptiness, and that the most dangerous thing in any room is the thing that everyone has already decided does not matter. She turned her head and looked at him. Her scales caught the last of the light. He scratched behind her left ear, which she permitted, and they sat together in the quiet and watched the stars come out over Solva Prime. Each one a small point of light she was already, slowly, beginning to keep.